Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. By the way, please be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. The best-selling author of America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, Mark Steyn publishes regularly in National Review, The Washington Times, Investor's Business Daily, and in venues in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, a one-man Commonwealth Association, and he is a frequent guest host for Rush Limbaugh. Mark, the end of the world as we know it. First question, you mean that as a provocative overreach to get everyone's attention?
No, I think we are at the end. Like all Cassandras, you write a book warning about the apocalypse in hopes that you can ward it off. But I think whether we do ward it off or not, we are at the end of the post-World War II global order, and a lot of things have to be rethought as a consequence of that.
Segment 1, the numbers. Let's just lay out the demographic argument. I'll quote from America Alone. This book is about the larger forces at play in the developed world that have left Europe too enfeebled to resist its remorseless transformation into Eurabia, and that call into question the future of much of the rest of the world, including the United States, Canada, and beyond. The key factors are 1, demographic decline, 2, the unsustainability of advanced Western social democratic states, and 3, civilizational exhaustion. So we'll take each of those in turn. Demographic decline, the argument.
Well, Europe has simply given up, for the most part, having children. If you take the Mediterranean countries, for example, we tend to think of them in our stereotypical way as big fecund cultures, big Italian mamas, big Greek mamas, my big fat Greek wedding,
right.
Big fat Greek loving family. In fact, they have collapsed birth rates. Germany, Japan, and Italy are already in net population decline. They have upside-down family trees. They have 4 grandparents with 2 children and 1 grandchild. That doesn't have to go on for a long time until you're in serious trouble and you reach a point beyond which you can't recover. And that's what a lot of European countries are at now. Now, some of them are just going out of business. If you look at Eastern Europe, some of the countries that were, until 20 years ago, part of the Soviet bloc, they gave up having children, and they're in population decline, and there's no successor population. What happened in Western Europe is slightly different. In effect, Western Europe imported a large Muslim population to be the children it couldn't be bothered having themselves.
And the Muslim birth rate is?
Well, the Muslim birth rate is said to be, because, you know, in a politically correct culture, they don't keep a lot of official figures on this. But compared to the average ethnic European birth rate, where they have 1.3 children per couple, the estimated Muslim population is 3.5. Now, the official British statistic from the official British Government Statistics Office says that the Muslim population of the United Kingdom is growing 10 times faster than the general population. That doesn't have to go on long for the numbers to even out. If you say people think it takes a long time, but if you say have a 90% population, let's not make it any kind of racial thing. Let's call them the Munchkins. Say 90% Munchkins, and they have 1.3 children per couple, and then you have a 10% ethnic minority. You can call them the Ruritanians, call them whatever you want, but they have 3.5 children. That 90% and that 10% will have roughly the same number of grandchildren. So in other words, in two generations is all you need, and you've caught up. Yeah.
Right. Now, you write in America Alone, I'm quoting you, today's high Muslim birth rates will fall, and probably fall dramatically, as the Catholic birth rates in Italy and Quebec have. Question, what is your underlying theory of what drives birth rates? Why would the Muslim birth rate fall?
Well, I think there's two kinds of things that drive birth rates. Right. One is it's basic kind of economic improvement. People move from a primitive agricultural society where you don't need large numbers of children to work the farm into more developed societies where you need fewer numbers of children. What's happened in Europe has gone beyond that, though. Mm-hmm. In effect, the social democratic state has said you don't need to worry about children or grandchildren or anything like that anymore. You're taken care of from cradle to grave. There's a relatively high price in taxation to be paid for that, and that's why having a child is expensive in the modern world today. So people have fewer children because it's an economic liability. So if you don't have to have them, why have them? 40% of German female university graduates are childless. We talk about the maternal instinct, but evidently it isn't that instinctive. Not if you're German,
French or German or Spanish. So, give me. By the way, this business about the Muslim birth rate falling, I have the feeling in reading America Alone that you almost toss that to the opposition, because even that need not necessarily be the case.
Well,
as witness say in the Church of Latter-day Saints in Utah, Salt Lake City is a completely modern town,
right?
But it has the highest birth rate in the United States.
Yes,
that is to say, it's not necessary.
No, and that's why the Mormons have spilled the banks of Utah, and why Mitt Romney can be running as a Mormon candidate for president from Massachusetts. They've outgrown the state in a basic sense. And I think you can see similar things in Britain. For example, Pakistani immigration went down for the first Pakistani birth rates went down for the first generation of Pakistani immigrants in the 1970s. Something very odd happened then in the 1980s and 90s, that it started creeping back up again. In other words, as soon as there was a big enough Pakistani population in northern England to be able to live in a kind of Pakistani culture, they resumed Pakistani-style fertility rates. So I accept, and I concede that point immediately, that certain Muslim birth rates are falling. But which ones are they? They're generally speaking the more moderate ones. The Tunisian fertility rate is a Western fertility rate. In Turkey, why is Kemal Ataturk's Turkey turning into just another Islamist society? Because the Kemalist, westernized Turks have a Western birth rate, and that great vast Turkish rural hinterland in the east retained a traditional Muslim birth rate, spilled its banks, like the population in Utah, and moved into the cities. And that's why whatever happens to Turkey, Kemalist Turkey is dead, gone, over. And if the Pentagon and the State Department don't get that, they shouldn't be in those buildings.
Segment 2, the unsustainable habits of the West, again from America Alone. Quote, the European welfare state depends on economic growth and population growth. The former is now barely detectable, and the latter is already in reverse. Close quote. Explain why the welfare state in Europe depends on both economic and population growth. First your premise.
Well, if you don't have welfare, a declining population is not a big problem. I mean, it's a problem in a kind of cultural sense, that you won't have a very hip pop music business if you've got very few young people.
Right.
But actually, personally, that would suit me just fine. I don't want a lot of young.
You and I would be happy with Frank Sinatra.
Yeah,
right.
I would be happy to have Doris Day and trade Lady Gaga to wherever she wants to move to. So if you lose your young people, you have certain cultural consequences.
Right.
But not necessarily economic ones. I mean, my town in New Hampshire, the population peaked in the 1810 census. And then what happened, the sheep farming industry in New Hampshire collapsed. People moved out to the west. People moved to the mill towns in southern New England. And my town's population declined all the way till the 1940 census. But it didn't matter, because we didn't have a welfare state predicated on the basis that there would be sufficient young people to pay for the retirements of the old people. Now, when we say retirement, by the way, we're talking about a problem that most societies before ours never had. If you look at Greece, something like the best part of 300 professions in Greece, you're allowed to take retirement at 50. 50. So in other words, you work from 20-something to the age of 50, and then you spend 3 decades living at somebody else's expense. Well, who's going to be that somebody else? If you don't have any children, you've got to import someone to be the somebody else, and the people that Europe decided to import were Muslims.
Almost every issue facing the European Union, I'm quoting again from America Alone, from immigration rates to crippling pension liabilities, has at its heart the same root cause, a huge lack of babies. Close quote. Give me a kind of summary statement, if you can, on why France, as we know it, can't survive under the current birth rate.
Well, it depends on what you think a nation is. If a nation is just a zip code, if a nation is a gate at LAX and it just happens to be an accumulation of the people who are standing around in the gate waiting for whatever until their flight is called, then yes, there will be a France and there will be a Netherlands and there will be an Italy and a Germany. But if you think that a nation is the accumulated inheritance of its past, then there will be no France, and there will be no Germany, and there will be no Italy. It's just a couple of days ago, a prominent politician in Angela Merkel's party in Germany called for the removal of crucifixes from German schools. Germans are post-Christian, like most of Europe, but it is part of their cultural inheritance that you will still see crucifixes displayed in German schools. This Muslim lady is making the point that this now...
the official was a Muslim?
Yes, this is a Muslim member of Angela Merkel's party in Germany, and she's making the reasonable point that these crucifixes no longer speak to what Germany is, and more to the point, what Germany will be in 20 years. So they're going to go. It doesn't even have to be anything that basic. If you look at British pubs, you look at the English village pub. Is there going to be a need for an English village? I mean, if you know English villages well from your university days, Peter,
right.
You know, if you go to those villages in Oxfordshire, you'll have a tiny little main street on which there'll be 6, 7, 8 thriving pubs.
Right.
Now, once that population becomes 20, 30% Muslim, how many of those pubs are still going to be in business? So it affects everything. It transforms. You can't have this kind of population transformation without having a broader cultural, socio-economic, and political transformation too.
Okay, so let me tell you what I think of when I think of France. 1, nominally, but still nominally, Catholic. 2, rigid separation between church and state, the laïcité policy. 3, a vivid sense of having played a role in European history. Some sense, because the French educational system is pretty good at history as best I can make it out, the kids will understand Napoleon and the Revolution and the long line of French kings through Louis IX all the way back to Pepin. So they will place themselves in relation to the long story of European history. Give me what France will look like, how those 3 aspects of what I think of as French will be changed in 20 years, say.
Well,
or is 20 years too little? Am I taking?
No, I don't think so. I think in 20 years' time, just to take, you mentioned schools. I mean,
right.
If you take, for example, Antwerp in Belgium, 40% of the children in Antwerp elementary schools select Islamic studies as their religious studies class, versus 26% for Catholic and roughly the same number for non-confessional studies. So in other words, that is the future of Antwerp. So 20 years' time, all those grade schoolers are going to be in their late 20s and early 30s. So you're not wrong. That's the time frame we're talking about. And in France, most of those Catholic schools... most of those Catholic churches are going to be closed. Maybe some of them will be retained as heritage sites, but they're not going to be living Catholic churches. If you think of what was once St. Sophia's Cathedral in Istanbul, it's now a museum. So you can go and see you can go and see what was once there, but it's no longer a going concern, and that's what those Catholic churches will be like. You talk about the history that's taught in French schools. They're not going to be teaching the Second World War in French schools because it's going to be problematic. The
Chirps were on the wrong side.
Well, and beyond that, the whole question of the Holocaust becomes contentious when you're teaching it to Muslim school children. That's why Dutch schools, for example, decide discretion is the better part of valor, and it's easier just to skip the whole Second World War. British schools increasingly find it's easier to skip the Crusades. So when you have this kind of essentially population transformation, it changes not only the present and the future, but it even changes the past, because the past has to be retrospectively brought into line with some kind of new national narrative.
Segment 3, civilizational exhaustion. Again, America alone. Quote, a suicide bomber may be a weak weapon, but not against a weak culture. Explain that.
Yeah, essentially Islam has bet that we have expensive toys. We've got the best kind of aircraft carriers. We've got the best kind of tanks. We've got the smart bombs. And that's a short-term advantage. If you want to pick a fight on a battlefield, if you want to pick a fight that is slightly more ambiguous, that never actually calls out the force you're up against onto the battlefield for a big tank battle, then what matters is will. What matters is will. And they have bet that the West does not have the will to defend itself. And they see that every day of the week. For example, in the way Comedy Central just a couple of days ago caved in and censored the show South Park. I don't really know much about South Park. I don't watch it particularly. I don't have a TV reception worth speaking of. But one thing I do know is that 10 years ago, South Park was able to do a Mohammed joke and it went on the air and it was broadcast and nobody threatened to kill anybody over it. Right. What has happened since then is that we have taught these people the lesson that if you threaten to kill and you threaten to murder and you threaten to intimidate, you don't actually have to kill or murder anyone. The culture will just cave anyway.
All right. You identify a couple of sources of this civilizational exhaustion. Let me try to ask you for an explanation of each. Again, I'm quoting from America Alone. Most mainline Protestant churches are to one degree or another post-Christian. They hold, actually I'm quoting this sentence just because I love the sentence. Deep breath. They hold that if Jesus were alive today, he'd most likely be a gay Anglican bishop in a committed relationship, driving around in an environmentally friendly car with an arms are for hugging sticker, close quote. The West is exhausted because it has ceased to believe.
Well, I think it has ceased to believe in anything. And by that I mean it's not necessary for everyone in a Western nation to be a believing and observant Christian. Mm-hmm. But you have to understand, I think, that your civilization springs from a relatively narrow foundational source. I find it, I like atheists, but I must say I find the quality of atheism has deteriorated dramatically over the last century. If you go back to the late 19th century when Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he at least respected God enough to want to pick a fight over his existence or not. That's something slightly more sophisticated than if you look at Richard Dawkins or, for example, Christopher Hitchens, a smart guy, a man I like very much, yes. A man who is on the right side of most things. But Christopher Hitchens says religion poisons everything. I don't understand how you can look at most of the great artwork of Western civilization. I don't understand how you can listen to Mozart or Brahms and say that. It's not necessary to be an observant Christian to hear the beauty in a great European requiem mass that springs from that Christian tradition. And so the idea of trashing our civilization in the interests of, I think, a multicultural nullity, I think has been a disaster. And I think it's left a great big hole where our identity ought to be.
Second cause of civilizational exhaustion, you argue, and I quote again from America Alone, quote, "The populations of wealthy democratic societies expect to have total choice over their satellite TV packages, yet think it perfectly normal to allow the state to make all the choices in respect of their health care. The torpor of the West derives in part from the annexation by government of most of the core functions of adulthood." Close quote. Explain that one.
Well, I don't think it's very difficult. I think if you take a picture of the average 13-year-old in California today, and then you take a picture of a 13-year-old from, say, my part of New Hampshire, circa 1878, just put those photographs side by side. Which one would you be willing to leave your house to if you had to go away for a weekend? Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a very difficult question to answer that. Now that's fine when you're 13, but what happens when you extend adolescence? The President of the United States has just told us that if you're 26 years old, you can stay on your parents' health insurance plan. So he's basically said at 26, you're still a child.
Childhood extends to 26. Right?
On your 27th birthday, you've got to finally shape up and move out of your parents' insurance agency. But until then, you're a child. The problem with that is that I think we have essentially created a society of permanent adolescence, where the important business, healthcare, why is it that people could make their own healthcare arrangements 50, 100, 200 years ago, but that now the state has to do it for us? And what does that say about us? When you insulate people when you insulate your citizens from all the most basic pressures of life, what kind of citizenry do you wind up with? And that's why I do think we are creating essentially a society of permanent adolescence, where we talk about our iPods, we talk about the music we listen to, we talk about our cable packages, whereas everything important, the decisions are made for us by the government.
Segment 4, Steyn and his critics. The Economist magazine called your book, quote, an alarmist's creed. The Guardian, one of Britain's leading newspapers, said, quote, Steyn's book is indeed alarmist. Maclean's magazine, for which you write. Maclean's, the Canadian magazine, called the book, once again, alarmist. Why can't you put your argument more calmly? You have something important to say. Why not say it in a way that appeals to the intellectuals who have their hands on the levers of power?
Because I think it's actually happening so fast that if we want to do anything about it, we need to do it quickly, or the entire Western world is going to be out of business. What I find fascinating, really, after publishing the book, is that the progressive mind denies there's anything to argue about. You know, some people will pick a fight with me and say, "Oh, the idea that Europe will be Muslim by the year 2030 is absurd. Maybe by 2070 or 2100." Right. So in that case, we're not arguing about the destination. Right. We're only arguing about the length of the journey. But more and more people say, "Well, what would be so wrong? What would be so wrong if the Western world did become Muslim?" And that, I think, is the self-neutering result of the multicultural mindset. You remember Mayor Nagin in New Orleans. When it turned out that a lot of the people who'd moved away didn't want to come back, he got all worried about that because he said New Orleans has always been, quote, a chocolate city, unquote. Mm-hmm. In other words, he thought that who lived there made a difference to what the city was. Why can't you make that point about Italians in Milan? Why can't you make that point about Swedes in Malmö? Why can't you make that point about Dutch people in Rotterdam? And I think that's what I find fascinating, that the leftist progressives say, well, what's the big deal if the whole world becomes Muslim? What would be wrong with that? Right. And I think what the response to that is, well, look, you know, okay, which currently Muslim city would you want to live in?
Exactly.
I like the Muslim world. I spent a lot of time in the Muslim world. I love Amman. I love Cairo. I love visiting them. But would I want to raise a family in Cairo? Would I want to try and do business in Cairo? Would I want to try and exercise my right to free speech even in Jordan, which is a supposedly moderate Muslim state? No. I'm very happy to visit them, but I'm very happy to come home to free, pluralist Western societies.
All right, let's move on to a critic of yours who plays fair, to the extent that he certainly doesn't want all of Europe to become radical Muslim, and understands that something is at stake. Christopher Hitchens, quote, Steyn makes the same mistake as did the late Italian journalist Oriani Fallaci, considering European Muslim populations as one. Little binds a Somali to a Turk or an Iranian or an Algerian, and considerable friction exists among immigrant Muslim groups. Argument 1. Argument 2. Moreover, many Muslims actually have come to Europe for the advertised purposes, seeking asylum and to build a better life. Close quote. Calm down. Those 40% in Antwerp don't get along that well with each other in the first place, and some of them are there because it's Antwerp. They get to be less Muslim and more secular.
Well, I think the way to look at that is, with respect to Christopher Hitchens, is I think that was true a couple of generations back. I think, for example, if you take a Pakistani immigrant to Scotland, that just happens to be an example, a real-life example I happen to know, 1950.
Right.
That Pakistani immigrant to Scotland would have had a broadly similar education to the guy in Scotland. So in other words, he's coming to a land that he has been raised, in a sense, to live in. He is coming to the imperial metropolis from the fringe. So he already comes semi-assimilated. Now you take a Pakistani immigrant who comes in the year 2010. He'll have been educated in a madrasa. He'll know Islam, but not much else. He's far more foreign in that sense to Scotland than he would have been 50 or 60 years ago. But also I think there is a difference. And this is where the numbers come into play, that was simply not possible to live in a Muslim world in inner city Scotland in 1950, whereas it is now. What you see in Malmo, Sweden, where Jews are fleeing, in the most progressive society in Europe, social democratic Scandinavia, Jews have concluded there's no future for them in Malmo, and they're getting the hell out of there. Why? Because it's a Muslim city, and in a sense, there are so many Muslims in Malmo that Sweden has assimilated with Islam rather than the other way around. So I think, with respect to Christopher Hitchens, he profoundly overestimates Westernization. And Christopher should know this. There's a fascinating series of pictures that was published on the internet a couple of months ago, showing the female graduating class from Cairo University in 1958, 1979, and I think 2004. 1958, they're all bareheaded women. They look like young women, more or less not terribly different from young women you would have seen at the time in Western Europe or anywhere else. By 1979, half of them are covered. 2004, they're all covered. It's the arrogance, I think. It's the arrogance even of the left to assume that the societal pull is always in the direction of Westernization. In the Muslim world, that is not the case. It's gone backwards, and I think you can see evidence already that it's going backwards in northern England and other heavily Muslim parts of Europe.
Segment 5, your title, America Alone. You sum up European disdain for the United States by quoting the British journalist Brian Reed, who writes that Americans are, quote, self-righteous, gun-toting, military-loving, sister-marrying, abortion-hating, gay-loathing, foreigner-despising, non-passport-owning rednecks. To which Mark Steyn replies...
I think you left out the most colourful bit of that description,
well, there's a bit that's...
rather vivid mixturitions.
Go ahead, toss it in.
Yeah, who think that... I think God gave them the biggest... manhood in the world, I'm being discreet there, yes, so that they could urinate on the rest of the planet. It's something like that.
To which Mark Steyn replies, if one were to formulate it less disapprovingly, Brian Reed's Anatomy of Americans equals, quoting you now, culturally confident, self-reliant, patriotic, procreative, religious, democratic, constitutional rednecks who believe in national sovereignty rather than ineffectual poseur multilateralism, close quote. What makes the United States different?
Well, I think the United States is still different. I think it's clear that there's a big slab of the population here that is attracted to the idea of being like Europe. Europe has only been able to be like Europe the last 60 years because the United States has served as the guarantor of last resort. In effect, Germany doesn't need an army because the US Army lives in Germany, and so Germany has been free to spend its defense budget on socialized healthcare and all kinds of other things. In effect, US taxpayers pay for the German healthcare system.
In 2010, this year, we still have 50,000 troops. 60-some years after the end of the Second World War, we still have 50,000 troops in Germany. Right,
which is ridiculous, and any time anybody talks about withdrawing them, as Secretary Rumsfeld does, the argument now that was advanced at the time is that the closure of those bases would be devastating for surrounding German supermarkets and restaurants.
Right.
So that is why the United States taxpayer pays to keep this vast army in Germany, is because otherwise those supermarkets and restaurants would go out of business. So if America goes down the European path, who is going to be the sugar daddy for America in the way that America served as the sugar daddy for Europe? There isn't one. But what heartens me is that America is not yet European. I was very despondent by the results of as you can imagine, of the 2008 election. But what was interesting to me is the nature of the rebellion against that. There was the financial crisis, which happened in a lot of countries, and in a lot of places, from Iceland to Bulgaria, you had massive demonstrations of people pounding on the door of Parliament, saying, "Why didn't you, the government, do more for us?" This is the only country in the Western world where a mass protest movement rose up saying, why don't you do less for us? Why don't you get the hell out of our pocket? Why don't you keep out of our lives, big government, and we do just fine? And it's not clear to me whether it speaks for 50.001% of the American people, but it speaks for a significant chunk of them, and that differentiates the United States from most of the other Western nations.
You write, Mark, there are three possible resolutions to the present struggle. Again, I'm quoting from America Alone. 1, submit to Islam, but that would mean the end of Western civilization. 2, destroy Islam, but, quote, the slaughter would change America beyond recognition, close quote. 3, reform Islam, but, quote, ultimately only Muslims can reform Islam. All the free world can do is create conditions that increase the likelihood of Muslim reform, close quote. What kinds of conditions are those?
Well, I think historically, Islam has only been moderated by the overarching society. I mean, to an extent, the British Raj moderated Islam in India. It had problems with Wahhabist violence in the 19th century. They assassinated a viceroy and a chief justice in imperial India. But generally speaking, you know, the British Raj did have a moderating impact. The Indonesian dictatorship had a moderating impact on radical Islam. The Soviet Union did. The Central Asian stands were very agreeable places to be when the Soviet Union bust up. They have this disgusting alcohol they drink there. They're incredible. The world's most relaxed Muslims drinking this hooch. Very pleasant company. What happened was that the Iranians and Saudis then spent a ton of money radicalizing those people. So that teaches us a lesson. The lesson here is if you're not on ideological offense, you're going to get rolled. This idea that somehow our deference to Islam prevents us from, to make the Christopher Hitchens point, identifying the various mom and pop strains of Islam around the planet that we're in favor of, or just letting the House of Saud and the Iranian mullahs annex anything that takes their fancy, is a recipe for disaster. None of those precedents are attractive to Americans, because Americans don't think the Indonesian dictatorship or the Soviet Union or even the British Raj are terribly attractive. So they're not in the ideological game.
What's the program for the United States?
Well, I think
if you we set Barack Obama to one side and make you president, or let's do it for experimental for the purposes of mental experiment. Let's make you dictator. What should the United States do?
Well, for a start, I would end ideological subversion of the United States and the Western world. I don't think
you tell the Saudis you stop supporting exporting Wahhabism.
Yeah, because basically the Saudis export ideology, not oil. Oil simply funds the export of ideology, and I would stop that, and I would do everything to stop it. I think the tragedy is that the Saudis are reaching the point where they've just about bought up everything they need to buy up in the Western world. Secondly, I do think that unless you have real serious cultural confidence, you should not have mass Muslim immigration. My view on that, I say that with regret, because I would like to believe that all societies can bring people there and create Americans, create Canadians, create Englishmen, create Dutchmen. But if you look at England, I mean, Englishmen whose families have been living there since 1066 are no longer English in any meaningful way. So the idea that you can take some child bride off the boat from Mirpur and turn her into a functioning British subject in any way is, I think, highly dubious. And so I do think that at some point we have to grasp the nettle of mass immigration, which is always a sign of societal weakness. Whatever one feels about it in theory, a dependence on mass immigration is a sign of a structural defect in society.
Final question, Mark. This will take a moment or two to set up, but I think it's evocative enough to make it worthwhile. Two assessments of the future. Malcolm Muggeridge, the great late British journalist, who in his later years used to tell young people when he was lecturing in this country, as indeed he told me, that we would soon find ourselves in the position of St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, North Africa, who writes the City of God as news of the sack of Rome reaches him. This flower of classical civilization, St. Augustine, who in his own lifetime watches it all slip away. That's assessment one. Assessment two, the present Pope, Benedict XVI. You write yourself, again in America Alone, quote, the future implicit in then Cardinal Ratzinger's name for his papacy, Benedict XVI. St. Benedict is born in Umbria, 480, just 50 years after the death of Augustine, and St. Benedict ensured, quoting you, that critical elements of civilization were preserved and that they would emerge as the basis for Europe and Western civilization. Pope Benedict XVI once quoted a Benedictine motto, pruned, it grows again. So you have Malcolm Muggeridge, sorry chaps, it's the end. And you've got Benedict XVI, who seems to be suggesting that after a period of struggle, rebirth.
I think it was easier in the original Benedict's day. I am worried that we are essentially delivering Western technology, which can peer into every nook and cranny of our lives. And we are creating transnational institutions that will end up being run by profoundly illiberal sources. If you look at the biggest voting bloc at the United Nations, for example, it's the Organization of the Islamic Conference. That's an interesting name. If it was what would the left make if there was a group of nations called the Organization of the Christian Conference?
Right.
They'd be hopping mad about it.
Right.
But they're not about the Organization of the Islamic Conference. 58 nations who make the running, especially in things like the Human Rights Council at the UN. So in other words, these international institutions that were set up mainly by the United States in the late 1940s because the US didn't want to be an imperial superpower. So it created these transnational institutions that have now that are falling remorselessly into the hands of the enemies of liberal societies. And I think that gives the second Benedict a tougher job than the first Benedict has. I don't want to subscribe to Malcolm Muggeridge defeatism. I'm a happy warrior. But turning this thing around is going to be hellish work. And I think at a certain point we're going to find little citadels of light on what is otherwise a very dark planet. In other words, I think pruned it grows again, maybe, but the pruning is going to be far more severe than we yet know.
Mark Steyn, author of America Alone, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.